President Trump's proposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico may be temporarily on hold, but they have already exposed a critical vulnerability in America's lumber industry. The latest round of tariffs, set to take effect this Wednesday, hits kitchen cabinets and furniture hardest. Lumber, however, is once again caught in the crossfire of America's trade war. Every new home built in the United States carries a quiet dependency most buyers never notice. Nearly 9 out of 10 lumber imports, about 87%, come from Canada, supplying roughly 25 to 30% of all the wood America consumes. Walk through any new subdivision, and the framing overhead is almost always Canadian softwood. That balance shattered when the Trump administration imposed tariffs exceeding 45%, betting the pressure would force Canada to bend and trigger a domestic production boom. Instead, the opposite happened. Canadian mills shut down rather than absorb what many saw as economic ransom. Meanwhile, American producers faced a reality they could not escape. U.S. lumber production cannot expand fast enough to replace Canadian supply. Construction costs surged, projects stalled, and an already fragile housing market slid toward crisis. Even under ideal conditions, assuming U.S. lumber output grows 10% annually, true self-sufficiency would not arrive until 2029 or 2030. Canada lost sawmills, jobs, and rural lifelines. The United States risked the very supply keeping housing marginally affordable. So how did this timber war spiral so far? For decades, the North American lumber trade functioned quietly in the background. Canada harvested vast softwood reserves. The United States processed them into homes and manufactured goods. The system worked because it was built on geography, specialization, and mutual economic benefit, not political theater. That balance began to fracture in May 2017 when Canadian softwood lumber exports were hit with countervailing and anti-dumping duties averaging 27%. While the dispute echoed conflicts dating back to 1982, centered on U.S. claims that Canada's public forest ownership subsidized lumber, it initially felt familiar. Past disputes ended with negotiated settlements. This time was different. In August 2025, the Trump administration imposed a sweeping 35% tariff under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. 1 month later, an additional 10% duty was added under Section 232, framing lumber as a national security issue. By October 15th, total tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber exceeded 45%. Canada did not comply with U.S. demands to overhaul its forest management system. Instead, companies concluded that shipping lumber at those rates guaranteed losses. Mills began curtailing and closing operations. Curtailments at facilities in British Columbia and Alberta turned permanent. Production cuts totaled hundreds of millions of board feet. Executives acknowledged that once the 45% duty became a reality, there was no path back. The damage fell hardest in British Columbia, where allowable annual harvests had already declined by roughly 1/3 due to conservation set-asides, indigenous rights settlements, insect infestations, and wildfires. When mills closed, the fallout rippled outward. Pulp mills lost residual fiber. Panel and pellet producers faced shortages. Secondary facilities shut down. Employment collapsed. Rural tax bases shrank, and forestry-dependent communities hollowed out. The United States felt the shock differently. Canadian lumber, worth $8 to $10 billion annually, supports an estimated 70 to 80% of lumber used in housing and construction. When that supply faltered, builders faced higher costs and delays at a time when housing was already undersupplied and mortgage rates remained elevated. Builders faced three options: absorb the costs, pass them on to buyers, or delay projects. All three happened simultaneously, paralyzing construction. Claims that the U.S. could easily replace Canadian lumber did not hold up. While domestic mills could theoretically supply up to 95% of consumption, that figure assumed sustained maximum capacity, something the industry has never achieved long-term. Since 2016, capacity expansion took 8 years under favorable pricing conditions. Historically, production growth rarely exceeds 4 to 5% annually. Labor shortages, permitting delays, equipment constraints, and timber supply limits remain structural bottlenecks. Canada responded by reducing reliance on the U.S. market. Ottawa announced $700 million in loan guarantees, $500 million for diversification initiatives, freight discounts for domestic shipments, and procurement rules favoring Canadian materials. The strategy mirrored earlier responses in steel, aluminum, and critical minerals: reduce dependence, build domestic demand, and secure alternative buyers. This matters because the lumber trade is deeply integrated. Canadian wood feeds American factories, and finished products flow back north. In 2021 alone, U.S. exports of paper, packaging, and furniture to Canada exceeded $10 billion. As tariffs escalated, that ecosystem fractured. Mill closures reduced raw material supply. Manufacturing slowed. Jobs disappeared on both sides of the border. Consumer prices rose. The consequences fed directly into America's housing crisis. Housing starts remained far below levels needed to address long-term undersupply. Lumber tariffs added thousands of dollars to the cost of a typical home. Combined with high interest rates and tariffs on steel and aluminum, affordability reached levels unseen in generations. Production cuts pushed North American lumber output to its lowest level in a decade. Lower supply meant higher prices, fewer housing starts, and a deepening shortage. Long-term fundamentals for lumber remain positive, only if supply remains available at reasonable cost. Permanent Canadian mill closures and slow U.S. expansion threaten to delay recovery for years. In Canada, forecasts point to continued contraction through 2030. Smaller and older mills are expected to disappear, particularly in regions scarred by fires and infestations. Rural communities will bear the heaviest cost. When mills that anchor towns shut down, local economies collapse. Jobs disappear, and services disappear, and younger generations leave. That's the real price of the timber war. President Trump's proposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico may be temporarily on hold, but they have already exposed a critical vulnerability in America's lumber industry. The latest round of tariffs, set to take effect this Wednesday, hits kitchen cabinets and furniture hardest. Lumber, however, is once again caught in the crossfire of America's trade war. Every new home built in the United States carries a quiet dependency most buyers never notice. Nearly 9